This video contains a lecture on how to model the effects of demographic change and automation on economic growth within standard economic growth frameworks. The lecture is based mainly on the following list of papers, together with Abeliansky, Automation and Population Growth Theory and Cross-Country Evidence, published in the Journal of Economic Behavior and Organization. A paper I've written on the implications of automation for economic growth and the labor share, published in Macroeconomic Dynamics. A paper together with Clemens Lankisch and Alexia Pryskovets, How Can Robots Affect Wage Inequality, published in Economic Modeling. Then a paper I've written on population aging and endogenous economic growth, published in the Journal of Population Economics. A paper together written with Timo Trimborn on demographic change and R&D-based economic growth, published in Economica, and a paper written together with Holger Strulik and Alexia Pryskovets, The Past and Future of R&D-based Growth, published in the Journal of Economic Growth. We know that demographic change, and particularly population aging, and automation and digitalization are two of the main challenges that rich countries are facing nowadays, particularly European economies that are subject to fast population aging. Now, in this talk, what I would like to do is to introduce how demographic change and automation and digitalization can be introduced in the standard theoretical economic growth models for long-run economic growth, the R&D-based economic growth literature. Use these models to analyze the effects of automation and demographic change on productivity, economic growth, and inequality, and ask the question whether actually one of these challenges can be used as a remedy for the other. So we will see that automation and demographic change are very closely linked, and actually automation can be a response to demographic change. And finally, I'd like to ask the question whether we have some policy advices that emanate from these models that rich countries can apply, particularly the European Union. To set the stage and introduce to the topic, I have here the population pyramid of the world population, basically, retrieved from Our World in Data. And we see here the population pyramid in the year 1950. That's the blue area here. And this is very wide at the bottom and narrows at the top. So it has the shape of a pyramid. Population growth was positive, and the cohorts, the younger cohorts, were usually larger than the older cohorts. And the share of the population above the age of 65, 70, so the old age share of the population, was very small. Then decade after decade, the population growth rate decreased, fertility rates were falling. So this change, this huge growth here at the bottom of the pyramid leveled off, and life expectancy increased, so that here in these areas, the pyramid shifted kind of upwards or outwards, if you will. So over time, the pyramid became more and more a cylinder. So for the year 2100, the projections, for example, say that this is very much a cylinder. And here at the top, where you have the oldest people, the share of them to the rest of the population increases quite strongly. So this means that we will have many, many more dependent older people as compared to the workforce than we had in the year 1950. In the European Union, there has even been more pronounced aging. So we see here the population pyramid for the European Union in the year 2023. And basically this already has the shape of an inverse pyramid, at least below the age of 55 or so. So now the baby boom generation is retiring, and we will have fewer and fewer workers in the decades to come, as compared to the number of people that are in retirement. Of course, these developments have led to many concerns among policymakers, among economists, among the wider public, on the sustainability of pension systems when more and more retirees have to be financed by fewer and fewer workers, or the productivity of an older workforce. So you may have the situation that the productivity of people starts to fall below a certain age. And if you have population aging in such a situation, this leads to downward pressure on productivity growth. Technological progress may even slow down because older society may not demand very innovative products anymore, or they may not be able to handle them. And all this could lead to a decrease in economic growth. In the public debate, however, extreme voices often get a lot of weight. So, for example, there is this statement by Peterson, a former Secretary of State in the United States, that aging is a threat more grave and certain than those posed by chemical weapons, nuclear proliferation, or ethnic strife, which is really a very strong statement. Or if you go to Twitter, I mean, witness the debates there, it's typically the case that either alarmist voices dominate, or the people who say this is not a problem at all. So I think there is a need in this context for theory and evidence-based analysis of the implications of demographic change, and to use the insights from such a theory and evidence-based analysis to inform economic policymakers on appropriate policies that can be enacted in order to cope with the challenges of demographic change, and later also with respect to automation, as we will see. Now, the point of departure is, of course, if we want to say something about long-run economic growth effects, then the starting point would be the endogenous and semi-endogenous growth literature that describes the technological progress as the driving force of long-run economic growth and explains how technological progress emerges. So these are the prominent frameworks of Paul Romer, published in 1990, for which he got the Nobel Prize in 2017, or the Jones framework that got rid of some of counterfactual predictions of the original Romer framework and was published in 1995. So that's the semi-endogenous growth framework. The problem is that these frameworks are built upon the assumption that there is a single representative agent that makes all the economic decisions, and this agent is infinitely lived. And clearly, I mean, this may be a suitable assumption for many research questions. So if you are not interested in modeling demographic change or inequality for that matter, the assumption may be perfectly fine and make life much easier and not affect the outcomes in a kind of distortive way. However, if we want to analyze demographic change, such that we want to analyze increases in life expectancy, then clearly a representative agent that lives forever kills the possibility of analyzing this research question within such a framework. Also, if we are interested in the effects of some policies or whatever on inequality, if there's only one representative individual, of course, questions with regards to inequality don't make much sense. So to allow for the analysis of the effects of demographic change, we need to allow for a demographic structure in these kind of models. So what I assume here is that there is a risk of death, the mortality rate mu, that each individual faces at each moment. So people will die, and the share of the population that is older will correspondingly be smaller because these people had more time to die, if you will. So they were subject to the mortality rate for a longer period of time. Then there is a fertility rate, beta. That's the rate at which individuals or members of certain cohorts give birth to children. And as a result, the population growth rate is then the difference between the birth rate and the death rate. And the crucial point is that if we replace the single representative individual in endogenous and semi-endogenous growth models with such an assumption, we can analyze the effects of demographic change by varying the demographic parameters beta and mu that will then affect the mean age of the population and the population growth rate. Now, in general, as we will see, there will be two channels by which demographic change affects economic growth in such a framework. On the one hand, there are the demand-side effects, where demographic change affects the consumption saving choice of households, and therefore actually the growth rate of aggregate consumption. And this in turn has an impact on the interest rate. And since the interest rate is the crucial rate at which the proceeds of future R&D projects are discounted, this will have a strong effect on the incentives to carry out research and development in the first place. And there will be supply side effects, where demographic change has an effect on the size and growth of the workforce, and therefore on market size, which gives an incentive to firms to sell their products and therefore perform R&D to keep ahead of their competitors. And it will also affect the supply or the potential supply of researchers that can be used or that develop the new technologies in such a model. And different channels, as we will see, are operative in the Roma versus the Jones model, and also in the short to medium versus the long run. So we will see, for example, that in the Roma framework, the supply side effects are switched off by the demographic assumptions, while in the Jones model, for example, demand side and supply side effects will be present in the short to medium run, but the demand side effects will die out in the long run when we converge to the long run's balanced growth path. Let's go a little bit more into the mathematical details. We have here the utility maximization problem of a member of the cohort that was born at time t0. And such a member maximizes expected lifetime utility that is generated by consumption. So we have a utility function that is concave. So consumption increases utility, but at a decreasing manner. So the marginal utility of consumption is decreasing. And individuals discount the future at the discount rate rho. Now that's standard. But if individuals face the risk of death, we have to augment the discount rate rho by the mortality rate mu, because an individual who faces the risk of death is less likely to postpone consumption into the future. That's kind of intuitive. If you face the risk of death, you have a higher effective discount rate. The members of this cohort maximize their utility, the discounted stream, so the integral goes from 0 to infinity. Potentially, although the individuals face a risk of death, subject to the constraint that asset accumulation is determined by saving, where saving is the difference between income, which consists of asset income and labor income, and consumption expenditures. If this is positive, people save, and therefore their assets accumulate, and the time derivative of A is positive, so the change in assets is positive. If, by contrast, the consumption expenditures are higher than asset income and wage income, then assets would decumulate, people would run down their assets, and the time derivative of A would be negative. Asset income now consists of two parts: interest income, that's intuitive and clear, but in addition we have redistributions of a life insurance company, because it's assumed in such a model that individuals save in the form of annuities, so they buy a life insurance. And what a life insurance company does in the market equilibrium is it basically redistributes the wealth of those who die among those who survived. A fair life insurance company, in this case, it will pay out to those who survive higher than the market rate of return, but in exchange it gets the wealth of those who die. That's the Yari type of framework that was introduced into the Blanchard framework of perpetual youth that we have here and that we build into the Roma and Jones type of endogenous growth models. Now the result of utility maximization is this individual consumption Euler equation, which gives consumption expenditure growth on the left-hand side, optimal consumption expenditure growth as a function of the interest rate and the rate of time preference. So what we see is that individuals will have positive consumption growth if the interest rate is higher than the rate of time preference. In this case, financial markets overcompensate me for my impatience, so I will save. And saving means nothing else than consuming less today and more in the future, which means a steeper consumption growth profile, a positive consumption growth profile. If, by contrast, the discount rate is higher than the interest rate, financial markets cannot compensate me for my impatience. I will try to consume now, a lot now and less in the future, so I will have consumption expenditure growth that is negative. I will have decreasing consumption expenditures because I spend my assets and have fewer consumption possibilities in the future. Now, so far, this is rather standard. This you have in most kind of growth models, at least without the mortality rate mu. However, what you do not have in the Roma and Jones frameworks is a demographic structure. So we have solved the optimization problem for the member of one cohort, but if we want to come up with aggregate consumption and aggregate assets, the latter of which we denote by uppercase omega, then we have to integrate over consumption of all the individuals that are alive, so over all cohorts from minus infinity up to time t. And when we want to have aggregate assets, we integrate over all the assets of all the cohorts. And this then leads to the aggregate laws of motion for aggregate consumption and aggregate assets that we have here. What we see is that the so-called aggregate Euler equation, the equation of motion for aggregate consumption, differs crucially from the individual Euler equation. The individual Euler equation did not feature any of the demographic parameters. The reason is basically the presence of the life insurance company. So individuals do not really consider their mortality risk in the individual optimization problem. However, at the aggregate level, demography exerts a crucial impact on aggregate consumption growth. First, we see that the population growth rate features the aggregate Euler equation, because if the number of the size of cohorts grows faster, so if there is population growth, if more people enter the economy, you would have faster aggregate consumption growth as compared to individual consumption growth. And second, there is the so-called generational turnover correction term that corrects for the fact that at each moment in time, a fraction of older individuals who have had more time to accumulate assets in the past and can therefore consume more, they die due to their mortality risk, and they are replaced by newborns who do not have any assets and cannot afford that much consumption. And this continuously ongoing process of generational replacement of older cohorts with higher consumption levels by newer cohorts with lower consumption levels slows down aggregate consumption expenditure growth as compared to individual consumption expenditure growth. With respect to the asset accumulation equation, we basically have the standard resource constraint type of argument, so that everything that is produced has either to be consumed or invested, or in other words, we could have the evolution of assets is a positive function of asset income minus consumption expenditures plus wage income. So now this shows that there is a crucial influence of demographic change on the demand side of the economy, because the aggregate consumption growth equation depends on the parameters beta and mu. And if we change these parameters, in other words, if we change the demographic structure of the model, we will have an impact on the equilibrium growth rate, because the aggregate consumption equation is a central equation that determines the equilibrium growth rate in the Roma and Jones models. In the Jones model, in the short to medium run, not in the long run, but in the Roma model, in the short run and in the long run as well. Now let's come to the supply side effects of demographic change. In the Roma framework, the research and development production function is given by this expression here, which gives on the left-hand side the change in the stock of blueprints or technologies, as a positive function of, on the right-hand side, the productivity of scientists. LA, that's delta. LA is the number of scientists, and A is present due to the assumption of intertemporal knowledge spillovers. So it becomes easier to develop future technologies if I have already a certain stock of past technologies that I've accumulated. As we know, this leads to the prediction of the so-called scale effect, and in the Jones framework it was weakened by introducing an exponent phi that is smaller than 1. Here we have an exponent that is implicitly given by 1, and here we have phi, an exponent that is smaller than 1, and if you introduce that, you can get rid of the strong scale effect. Now, the strong scale effect in the Roma model also implies that the population size cannot be allowed to grow. The number of scientists cannot be allowed to grow, because otherwise we would have hyper-exponential growth, which is just at odds with all empirical evidence that we have on economic growth rates in the long run, right? So the population size is assumed to be constant in the Roma model, which implies that the population growth rate must always be 0. And that implies in turn that the fertility rate and the mortality rate have to be equal, so that population size and the number of scientists are constant. And if I assume this, population growth cannot be positive, and so the supply side effects of demographic change are switched off, basically. In the Jones model, by contrast, we have a research production function as is given here, where the intertemporal knowledge spillovers are weaker than in the Roma case. That gets rid of the scale effect, so the population and the number of scientists will be allowed to grow. So there will be positive growth of the population as the difference between the fertility rate and the mortality rate. Jones also introduces the stepping on those externalities so that he allows for the possibility that that researchers develop the same idea, and that leads to inefficiency basically. But this will not be at the focus of this chapter here. So the assumptions with respect to the scale effect are more important because they allow for this positive population growth. So that means that both supply side effects and demand side effects will be present in the Jones case. But as we will see, the demand side effects only matter during the transition phase to the long-run balanced growth path. So in the Jones case, as we know, it's the semi-endogenous growth model. So in the long run, nothing really matters. If you give research subsidies in this model, then you have a boost in growth in the short to medium run, but not in the long run. And the same happens with changes of the demographic structure that impact via the demand side effect, so changes in the interest rate, that will affect growth in the short to medium run, but not in the long run. In the long run, only the supply side effect is present, which is the change in the growth rate of the population that it is induced by changes in the demographic parameters. So these are the two main changes on the modeling side. And since this is a short lecture, I spare you all the technical details. So what you do is basically you solve the model as you solve the Roma model or the Jones model, but with a different aggregate Euler equation and with the demographic parameters that show up also in the research equation then, and in population growth and so on and so forth. And you can in the end derive an expression for the growth rate of the economy in the long run steady state or along the balanced growth path in both cases. And in the Jones case, what we also do is to simulate the growth rate during the transition phase to the long run equilibrium, which we did in this paper together with Timo Trimborn. Now, what we have in the Roma case is that increasing life expectancy, so if the mortality rate mu falls, that leads to more saving at the aggregate level. People live longer, so in general you would have more accumulation of capital. And that, of course, implies downward pressure on the interest rate, because the interest rate is the marginal product of capital. If you have a Cobb-Douglas type of production structure, then the accumulation of capital, the accumulation of assets would put downward pressure on the interest rate. This in turn raises actually the incentives to carry out research and development projects. Why? Because research and development leads to new goods. You can sell these new goods at the price above the perfect competition price and therefore earn operating profits. And the future operating profits are discounted with the discount rate of the interest rate. And if the interest rate, of course, changes or decreases in this case, the net present value of these future projects increases, and that provides more incentives to carry out R&D. That this is not just kind of an academic debate is kind of clear when you look at asset markets or stock markets, basically, where the stock price, particularly of tech companies, reacts very strongly to interest rate changes, much stronger than in case of other companies. And the reason is exactly that a large a part of their valuation is the expectation on future successful R&D projects, basically. So then the decrease in the interest rate then leads to higher incentives to invest in research and development, and this increases technological progress and economic growth. So the demand side effect actually that we have of this demographic change induces economic growth in this framework. The supply side effect is switched off because the mortality rate and the fertility rate change together such that population growth and therefore population size is not affected. In the Jones model, by contrast, we can change the mortality rate and the fertility rate independently of each other. So we can decrease the mortality rate, which would be the simulation of an increase in life expectancy. And what we have is that this increases population growth and therefore also economic growth in the long run, because the crucial driver of economic growth in the long run along the balanced growth path in the Jones model is population growth. So a decrease in mortality increases long run population growth and therefore increases economic growth. And exactly the opposite holds true for a decrease in fertility, because then population growth slows down and therefore long run economic growth slows down. And if they both change to the same degree, then there would not be a long run effect because the population growth rate would not change. However, in the short run, you would also have the demand side effects. So that's increase in saving and the decrease in the interest rate. And to look at what happens in such a situation, we simulated the model for the transition phase together with Timo Trimborn. And during that phase, we assumed demographic changes that are in line with the changes that we observed in the United States in the 20th century. So a strong fall in fertility and also a fall in mortality, but the fall in mortality is not so strong that overall population growth would increase. So population growth decreases because the fall in fertility is more pronounced than the fall in mortality. And we will see that this leads to faster growth in the short and medium run, but it slows down growth in the long run because in the long run population growth is reduced. So this picture here exactly gives the simulation of the path for the growth rate of per capita GDP, where we start with an old balanced growth rate of 0.45%, which is the dotted line here. That's the growth rate without any demographic change, so it stays constant. And then we compare this to an economy in which at time zero, the fertility rate falls strongly and the mortality rate also falls, but less than the fertility rate. And in this case, there is more accumulation of assets because people live longer. Therefore, the interest rate decreases and there are more incentives to carry out R&D in the short run. So the economic growth rate increases and only slowly starts to converge to the new long-run balanced growth rate, which is lower than the old balanced growth rate because the population growth rate is lower at the new steady state. However, what we also see here and what is crucial is that it takes 20 years for the growth rate to fall below the growth rate without the demographic change. So the demand side effects are present for a rather long time period. And if you kind of look at the level of per capita GDP, it would be higher than in the case without demographic change for even 40 years. So for quite a long time period. So if you have demographic change and a fall in the fertility rate that is accompanied by a fall in the mortality rate, and you will definitely see a decrease in long-run economic growth. Nevertheless, you can see an increase in economic growth and per capita GDP in the short to medium run for a substantial period of time, for up to 40 years, basically. Now we can take stock about this framework. So it allows to analyze the effects of demographic change in endogenous and semi-endogenous growth models. And we have seen that generally there seem to be positive growth effects of rising life expectancy. However, there seem to be negative growth effects of falling fertility. As I also said, the positive growth effects of falling mortality can last quite long, even if the fertility rate falls and falls by even a larger amount than the mortality rate in the Jones case. And basically, the framework provides an explanation for the empirical findings in the literature that there seems to be a positive effect of increasing life expectancy or of health, for that matter, on long-run economic growth. And this framework can explain why such an effect may be present. However, there is also a positive effect of fertility on long-run economic growth in the Jones case. And this is more difficult to square with empirical evidence because across countries, high fertility is rather correlated with lower economic growth. And in the next few slides, I will try to adjust the semi-endogenous growth model in a way that it can also generate an inverse relationship between population growth and economic growth that is more in line with the empirical evidence, arguably. Now, how can we fix this counterfactual prediction? And I come to the paper that is written together with Holger Strulik and Alexia Bruskavets, in which the main idea is that it is not raw labor that matters as a production factor, but it is human capital. So it matters how well educated individuals are, how healthy they are, and so on and so forth, because that crucially determines their productivity. And particularly with respect to the creation of ideas, the work of scientists, it's important how well these scientists are trained. It's important what human capital they have. It's not important how many uneducated people have, but how many people are well educated and can drive the technological frontier. And we introduce this into the model and endogenize, in this context, the fertility and education decisions of households, where there is a crucial quality-quantity trade-off. So if you have a family with many children, you may just not have the resources to invest in a Harvard education for everybody, right? So there is a certain trade-off. If you have only a few children, then you may be better able to invest in their education. And this trade-off will lead to a situation where actually, despite the fact that a decrease in fertility would lead to a decrease in population growth, it could still lead to an increase in the growth of human capital. And that may change the relationship between fertility and economic growth in such a model. So how do we implement this? We have here the objective function of a family that maximizes utility. We have an overlapping generation structure in discrete time now, which can be easier introduced into a discrete time version of the Roma and Jones framework than in continuous time when we have demographic change. So that these families maximize by choosing consumption, savings, the number of children, and education, where utility is assumed to be positively associated with consumption in the first period of life, according to a logarithmic utility function. In the second period of life, where savings carried over from the first period of life are multiplied by the interest rate, and the utility of that is discounted with the discount factor beta. And we have utility of having children, where the utility weight is eta, and by educating the children, where the utility weight is gamma. In addition, families have to obey a budget constraint, of course, so they cannot spend more on consumption, savings, and educating their children than their wage income, where WT times HT would be the wage income of a household if it supplied the whole available time on the labor market, which we normalize to 1, so 1 is the whole available time. So we have to subtract from this whole available time for work the time that families spend on rearing children. So tau is the time requirement for each child. And the outcome of this utility maximization problem is an expression for the fertility rate, the population growth rate, as a crucial function of the parameters for the weight of fertility and the weight of education, and for education expenditures also as a function of these utility weights. And what we see immediately is this quality-quantity trade-off effect. If parents want to have better educated children, so they have a higher eta, the population growth rate increases or can be shown to increase. While if the weight on education increases, the population growth rate will decrease. And it's exactly the opposite with education. So education increases when we have a larger weight on education, but it decreases if you have a larger weight on fertility. So we have this quality-quantity trade-off effect that if parents want to have more children, fertility increases and education decreases. And if parents want to have better educated children, fertility decreases and education increases. Now, I spare you again all the mathematical details, but essentially you solve the model with the population growth rate replaced by this expression here, and a human capital accumulation equation where human capital accumulation is determined by education decisions here. And what you then get is a long-run balanced growth rate of the economy that depends only on parameters, as in the semi-endogenous growth model, so we assume phi is smaller than 1. And we get a population growth rate. And the central point is that now a stronger preference for the number of children increases population growth, but decreases economic growth. And a stronger preference for education decreases population growth and increases economic growth. So this model then supports an inverse relationship between economic growth and population growth. And that's arguably more in line with the cross-country evidence on population growth and economic growth. Of course, in the very long run, over centuries or so, the slowdown in population growth would lead to a situation where you have a depopulated world or so. In this case, then in the very long run, one may have to think again about a suitable framework. But for the empirically relevant time period of a few decades, this model would predict increase in economic growth if the fertility rate decreases. So we can again take stock. Falling fertility and increasing education investments have positive effects on economic growth, and both of that fits to empirical observations across countries. So that years of schooling tend to be positively correlated with economic growth, and high fertility tends to be negatively correlated with economic growth. And as a small side benefit, the model can also be shown to hold for negative population growth, which the original Jones model is not designed for. Now there is another important aspect of the topic of this lecture, basically, but also as a response to demographic change, and that is automation. As we will see, automation can be one of the responses with which we can cope with demographic changes. Now, automation as a motivation, I've included two pictures here. Here is a picture of a car factory from about 100 years ago, where you see this assembly line here, that's physical capital, and you see people working there, so production is very labor intensive. So you have lots of people there, and you have this rudimentary capital in the form of this rudimentary assembly line. If you Google modern car factory, then what you get is a picture like this one here, where you don't see any people. Instead, you see two types of physical capital, I would argue. You see the traditional physical capital, the assembly line, and now you see a new form of capital that actually assumes the role of labor in the production process, and that's industrial robots. So suddenly it becomes possible that the production factor physical capital on its own produces output. That was not possible in this area. You needed labor input to produce output, where a Cobb-Douglas production function would describe the process very well. So you need labor, otherwise capital alone cannot produce. So if labor is zero, the Cobb-Douglas production function would imply that no output is produced. Here, however, things are different. You can produce output with only physical capital as an input. You don't need workers anymore. So the production function changes in a crucial way. Now, what we want to ask ourselves in this part is what the effects of automation are then on productivity growth and income, whether automation affects the distribution of income between labor and capital, so the functional income distribution, how it affects the personal income distribution, so the wages of low-skilled versus high-skilled workers, and in the end, whether automation can help with the economic consequences of the challenges of demographic change. So whether one grand challenge can actually be helpful in solving the other grand challenge. So what I did in a paper in 2019 was to augment the Cobb-Douglas production function to cope with automation. Before automation becomes feasible, output is produced with labor and with physical capital, where the output elasticities are 1 minus alpha for labor and alpha for capital. And we see here we cannot produce any output without labor. So this corresponds to this picture here, where we need workers in order to produce output. However, then automation becomes feasible. So we have a perfect substitute for labor suddenly. So we don't need any workers to produce output anymore. And that corresponds to this figure here. We can produce with physical capital alone. Now, this implies that the diminishing returns of physical capital accumulation are actually overcome by the presence of automation capital. So we can produce with physical capital alone, and that implies that we would not anymore have a steady state of this Solow model without technological progress, where the growth rate is zero. Instead, we can have the situation where the long-run economic growth rate is positive, even though there is no technological progress. And in this case, the growth rate is then given by a function of overall investment and this technology term alpha. So if you invest more, then of course you accumulate more automation capital and traditional physical capital, which would allow you to grow faster because you don't have diminishing returns to capital accumulation anymore. And at the same time, everything that slows down capital accumulation, the depreciation rate or capital dilution due to population growth, decreases long-run economic growth. So the crucial point is we have now an additional force for economic growth apart from technological progress, and that is automation. So the result is that perpetual growth becomes possible, even though there is no technological progress, so that automation acts as one driving force of productivity growth. And this is in line with empirical evidence by Gretz and Michaels, for example, who show that automation increases productivity. And that also implies that, according to this result, automation can help with the challenges of demographic change, at least in as far as the population growth rate would be decreasing, and that would reduce the growth rate of the number of workers. And this labor shortage that may arise due to this process can be countered by automation. However, can we also say something about the functional income distribution? Now, in this case, we intuitively would see that now we have a type of capital that competes with workers, and therefore their wage growth may keep subdued. But at the same time, the income that this new capital earns goes to the capital owners, of course, because the robots belong to somebody, and these are typically the investors. So we would expect that automation decreases the labor share and increases the capital income share. Do we see this in the model? So for that, we compute the wage rate, which is the marginal product of labor in the economy, and the rate of return on capital, which is the interest rate in the economy. And as we see, both of them depend in a standard way on capital and labor. So the wage rate increases with physical capital. If you have more assembly lines, you need to staff them, you need more workers, and that would lead to an upward pressure on wages. And if you have more workers, this would lead to a downward pressure on wages, and the opposite holds true with the return to capital. But now we have automation capital present, and this has exactly the opposite effect. Automation is in competition with labor, and therefore puts downward pressure on the wage rate, but at the same time, it puts upward pressure on the interest rate because it can assume the role of labor and therefore prevent the marginal product of capital from decreasing. Now, with that in mind, we can compute the labor income share. The definition of the labor income share is the wage rate multiplied by the number of workers, L, and divide that by total output. In the Solow model without automation, this would be 1 minus alpha. Irrespective of what happens in the economy, the labor income share is always constant. And that was actually the success of the Solow model because it was able to generate such a constant labor income share, which fit the data until the 1970s and 1980s. So it was not kind of the Harold-Doma model that was accepted in the end, because that did not lead to such a constancy in the labor income share. However, since the 1970s, 80s, we see a fall in the labor income share that the Solow model cannot capture. However, if you augment the Solow model with automation capital, then the labor income share is not anymore only a constant, but also a function of the fraction of robots in the economy. So if the number of robots increases, the labor income share would decrease. And that's actually what happened since the 1980s, 1970s, 1980s, basically. What we also see is that the automation augmented Solow model nests the original Solow model. If the number of robots is 0, then everything here cancels out and we are back in the old version of the model. So the robot augmented Solow model, automation augmented Solow model is more general than the basic Solow model. So the effects of automation on the labor income share would be to reduce the labor income share, and that is in line again with empirical evidence by Karababunis and Neiman on the fact that the labor income share has been decreasing, and by Eden and Gackel, who showed that automation plays a crucial role in the decrease of the labor income share. So this was on the functional income distribution. But can we also say something on the personal income distribution, so on the wages in the economy? And in the basic Solow model, we know that there is only one type of labor. So in this basic Solow model, we cannot say anything on the personal income distribution and the wage differential between low-skilled and high-skilled workers. But what we do in a paper with Clemens Lankisch and Alexia Bruskavets is to consider an extension of the production function where we allow for high-skilled and low-skilled workers. And we assume that low-skilled workers, these are mainly the assembly line workers, they are perfectly substituted by robots, but not the high-skilled workers that may work in management or as engineers and maintain the robots and so on and so forth. So we assume here sub-CES production function, where overall we have a Cobb-Douglas production function in traditional physical capital, and if you will, labor-like inputs that can come from low-skilled, high-skilled workers or robots. So that's a Cobb-Douglas type of production function. And then within the labor-like input here, we have a CES structure. So we have that high-skilled and low-skilled workers are imperfect substitutes, with the substitutability being determined by gamma. If gamma is equal to 1, we would have perfect substitutability. Gamma going to minus infinity would be perfect complementarity. Gamma equal to 1 would lead to a Cobb-Douglas sub-production function structure. And arguably the reasonable range of gamma is between 0 and 1. In this case, low-skilled and high-skilled workers would be gross substitutes. And that's what many papers in the literature actually assume, and what also empirical evidence usually seems to find. So we can now compute the wage rate again as the marginal product of labor, of both types of labor. So we have to take the derivative of the production function with respect to LH to get the wage rate of high-skilled workers, and with respect to LL to get the wages of low-skilled workers. The expressions are quite long and cumbersome, so I didn't put them here. But if you divide these two, you get the skill premium. So the extent to which the wages of high-skilled workers are higher than the wages of low-skilled workers. And what we see here immediately for the reasonable parameter case of gamma that is in between 0 and 1 is that an increase in the stock of industrial robots increases the skill premium. And that's essentially also what we've observed since the 1970s, an increase in the skill premium, while we also had an increase in the stock of robots. So we have here a quick numerical simulation of this model, where we see the skill premium in the United States as the dashed line here from 1970 to 2015. It increased strongly from about a little bit less than 70% to 120%. And the solid line is the model prediction. And we see here that the model predicts an increase in the skill premium. However, the increase that the model predicts is stronger than the increase that we observe in the data, because here the model starts at the lower level and ends at the higher level. But this would actually be expected, because the model does not allow for a change of the skill type. So it does not consider endogenous skill upgrading. And in reality, of course, we also had that the share of high-skilled workers increased tremendously over that time period. So, and in this framework, an increase in the share of high-skilled workers and the corresponding decrease in the share of low-skilled workers would mute the increase in the skill premium to some extent. So considering that would bring perhaps the model simulation closer to reality. So to summarize, automation raises the skill premium and therefore wage inequality. And this is in line, again, with the data on the skill premium over the last decades. And it's also in line with empirical evidence that points to the direction that automation actually is much less beneficial for low-skilled workers than for high-skilled workers. For example, by Gretz and Michaels, Acemoglu and Restrepo, or Dowd and co-authors, that all these results point into this direction. So the model predictions are consistent with that. The last question that we posed at the beginning of the automation digitalization section was whether automation can be helpful in overcoming the challenges of demographic change, actually. And the paper on which this is based is written together with Anna Abeliansky. And as a motivation in this paper, we have first a world map that shows the automation density across different countries. And the automation density is the number of industrial robots per worker in the manufacturing sector, basically. If a country has a darker blue color here, that indicates a higher robot density, and the lighter color indicates a lower robot density, White color means no data, but that is kind of very much in line with having a low number of industrial robots, basically. So in general, we can say that across the world, those countries that have a darker color here have more robots, and the countries with a lighter color have fewer robots. What we see is that particularly those countries that face severe demographic challenges, have very low fertility rates and strong population aging, such as Japan, South Korea, Germany, Italy, they have a high robot density, and countries that face less severe demographic challenges because either they have a higher fertility rate, such as France, or have had quite strong inward migration in the past, such as the UK from Eastern Europe, they do not have such a high robot density. And globally, those countries, also with a very high population growth, tend to have a lower robot density or no data. Now, what does our simple framework of automation say about this? So we have again the Solow model with automation, the two types of capital, and we assume that there is a no arbitrage relationship. So investors can decide whether they want to invest in traditional physical capital, the assembly lines, production buildings, machines, and so on, or in automation capital, the robots. And total savings, total investment have to be split among the two. And of course, rational investors would invest only in the saving vehicle that yields the higher rate of return. And the equilibrium, when there is investment in both types of capital, both need to deliver the same return. If we use this no arbitrage relationship, we can derive the equation of motion for the robot density. It's a function of past robot density, some parameters, and particularly the population growth rate. So we see if there is faster population growth, the robot density increases less strongly than in a country with lower population growth. And this kind of, so the central implication is that robot density, ceteris paribus, decreases with population growth. And the intuition behind that is clear. So if you have fast population growth, you also have fast workforce growth. That leads to downward pressure in wages. If wages are comparatively low, that means firms do not have an incentive to invest in automation. So take, for example, two countries, Nigeria and Japan. In Nigeria, you have fast population growth, many young workers, some of them or many of them unemployed. So the wage rate is comparatively low, and firms would not have an incentive whatsoever to invest a lot in industrial robots to save on the wage bill. By contrast, in Japan, where the population size is decreasing and there are labor shortages, there is a strong incentive actually for firms to automate production. So the theory tells us that indeed demographic change could be a driving force of automation. Intuition also is in line with that, and this figure at the beginning also suggests that the data are in line with this. But to test this more formally, what we do is we regress the growth rate of robot density on the number of control variables, time and country fixed effects, and the investment rate and the population growth rate both lagged. And if our theory would be valid, basically we would expect alpha to be negative. So what do we find? We use panel data methods, either dynamic panel data methods or fixed effects regressions, to estimate the equation on the previous slide. And what we see is that in all specifications, irrespective of which method we use, we have a coefficient estimate of the population growth rate that is about minus 1.6 to minus 1.8. And in most of the specifications, that is significant at the 5% level, except for the system GMM estimation, so the last column here. However, system GMM is known to be quite inefficient, particularly in small samples, and we only have data for around 60 countries in the dataset of the International Federation of Robotics, so it's not a surprise that the system GMM estimator yields insignificant results here. However, what we see is that the corrected fixed effects estimator in various forms with various initializations leads to kind of quite similar parameter estimate, and it is statistically significant, and this estimator is actually recommended in smaller samples instead of the system GMM estimator. for dynamic panel data regressions. However, what we also see is that perhaps there is not even a need to include the dynamic term here, because it's insignificant in 3 out of 4 specifications and marginally significant in 1, and it's close to 0 in absolute terms. And an indication for that is also that if we look at the fixed effects column, the coefficient estimate for population growth is almost the same as in the other columns, and it's significant. So kind of this all points into the direction that indeed what the theory tells us seems to be supported by the empirical evidence. So we can summarize the results of this paper that declining population growth indeed incentivizes automation. So countries that face more severe demographic challenges seem to employ more industrial robots. And that in turn implies that indeed one of the challenges, so which was automation and digitalization, because it can lead to higher inequality and so on, could, however, be a solution to the other challenge, to demographic change. So now we can come to the overall summary of the whole presentation, and that is that demographic changes affect economic outcomes, but the effects are more positive than perhaps the alarmist view would suggest. So increasing life expectancy is by itself something that we would value, and in addition we've shown that it can increase economic growth. Declining fertility can also lead to increasing economic growth in the short to medium run when it incentivizes education, but in the very long run it may indeed lead to a slowdown of economic growth. However, automation can be an endogenous response to demographic change, and so one of these grand challenges, automation, could be helpful in solving the issues related to the other, namely demographic change. However, what I would argue is that still wise policy making is important and can make a huge difference in coping with these challenges. And in the following slide, I'd like to discuss some policies that are at least partly also suggested by the frameworks that we've discussed. So which policies can be helpful? I think the most important one is education, and that this also comes out of the frameworks that I've presented here. On the one hand, education can help to educate the next generation, make them more productive, and that leads to improvements in productivity in general. But on the other hand, also education fosters idea creation. Good training of researchers is very important for technological progress, as we've also seen here. Education is important for young children particularly, so I think it's a shame in rich countries that we let pupils get out of school without being properly able to read and write and solving simple mathematical problems. So that needs to be tackled, particularly in rich countries. They can afford that. But also higher education. So I think it's important to invest in those areas that will be needed in the digital transition. So we need people with backgrounds in natural sciences, in engineering, and so on and so forth. So I think there is a lot to do to invest in these areas. Then, of course, associated with education is retraining. We've seen that with automation and digitalization, it may be the case that some tasks or occupations as such will get automated, and people working in these tasks and occupations may not be needed anymore there. So it's important that we foster lifelong learning and retraining so that these people can be retrained. There will be a lot of demand in many areas in the economy, so it's important that we allow these retraining opportunities and that we foster the possibility for retraining. Of course, it's important to not be naive in this area, so we will not be able to retrain everybody. That's definitely for sure. So there will be people who will really suffer from automation and digitalization and where retraining efforts may fail. And for them, I think it's very important to have a strong social security net in place so that those who really need help have such a social security net available. Particularly important, in my opinion, in this context is the availability of health insurance, also in case that you lose your job. Then retirement policies could be very important. They could help with actually two different aspects. On the one hand, in a country that faces demographic challenges and there are labor shortages, increasing the retirement age could help alleviate these labor market challenges to some extent. And at the same time, the increase in the retirement age helps with the fiscal sustainability of pension systems. Of course, also here, we should not be or pursue naive policies. Not everybody will be able to work until the age of 70 or whatever. So there will be occupations where this is simply not possible. But there will be other occupations where people may even want to work longer. For example, there are countries that have a legal retirement age and you are forced to retire even if you want to work longer. And I think there should be more flexibility in the system and a cross-subsidization so that those people who want to work longer and to work in occupations that allow them to work longer should be allowed to do so, and the savings of that could be used to fund retirement for those people who just cannot work anymore because of their health and because they work in occupations where this is not possible. So I think the flexibility is important here, and one policy fits everybody, that should be avoided. So this discussion already made clear that health is another very important aspect to invest in. Population health is very important in general, but even more so when we think about increasing the retirement age. So we want to have a healthy population for its own sake, and also, of course, a non-healthy population cannot cope with increases in the retirement age. So I think investments in population health, in prevention and so on, that's very important. Another aspect is technology policies. So we need to ensure that we are not completely overtaken by others. And at the moment, it seems that the European countries, European Union policymakers there are kind of sleeping while we are overtaken by China, India, the United States, and so on. So we need to invest in those types of technologies that are important in the digital transformation. It is not sufficient to cook up new rules and regulations and think that we are innovative because we have nice data protection rules, which may be important, but that is not enough for having for fostering progress and fostering prosperity. So there we need technological progress. We need to invest in new technologies. Particularly important in this context are investments in basic research, in applied research and development, and in the diffusion of technologies in general. And we have seen that automation, for example, digitalization, could actually be a response, an endogenous response to the challenges of demographic change, and policymakers can foster this endogenous response and even improve things by investing more in R&D, in digitalization, in automation. So overall, thank you for your attention.